The following is a preview of a Patreon exclusive.
Okay, are we ready?
Let's do it.
Okay, so I thought we would start. I want to kind of lay some, like, I won't say ground rules, but some definitions, right? And it's about the way I was kind of envisioning the show going is, as we're talking about some of these things, there are natural characters, locations, episodes, stories that are probably, hopefully, going to pop in your mind, right? So for you or anybody in the chat, at any point, if you kind of want to cite an example of something that you think of, please do so. I think that would help the show a lot, because I don't have all of them written down. I've got some of my own personal ones that kind of came up.
I'm looking at the show notes and I don't believe you on that statement.
Yeah, there's a lot here. We're not going to do all this. I promise you. This is like how I do my show notes, or what I'm doing, like my research. And it may or may not make it onto the show, but let's be real. It probably is. Okay. So let's talk about, so a rebel, right? I think we all kind of know that one. Person who rises in opposition against an armed resistance against an established government or ruler. That one's pretty
Right.
straightforward. They gave us that out of the gate in episode 4. We kind of understood that, which was the next definition, that there was an empire, right? An
Right.
imperialism. And for the sake of this conversation, I'm using imperialism and colonialism very similar, because there are some nuanced differences between the two,
Sure.
specifically about how I guess the invader, if you want to call it that, the power, the larger power, goes about taking over different groups. But for the sake of this discussion, the empire in Star Wars is acting very much as an imperialistic government as well as a colonialistic government. I mean, they do all the same. They're doing all the isms, right? When it comes to kind of taking over stuff. So we're going to use them both at the same time. Here's where the definitions really start to kind of mix and blend for me, right? And I'm just going to, so freedom fighter, partisan. We can talk about terrorists, which is in there as well, but even rebel, I would say all three of those. And there's other ones. There's what was the other one that came up a couple times that I didn't put it in the show notes, but there are a lot of different names for these, and they all have kind of slight variations as to what they do. But I think in Star Wars, they tend to use these names just at will to mean a lot of the same stuff without really getting into the more nuanced details like we have in our own real world.
I think what we're starting to see though is they're putting them out there and they're showing that people don't understand the differences, but there are very clear differences between what their idealisms are. And that's why they go through the effort of actually identifying them separately. So Saw Gerrera being a partisan is because he fits this very specific mold,
Hmm.
rather than this group of rebellion
That's a
of
good point.
rebels in a
Yeah.
rebellion. So I think they might be using them interchangeably in some circles, but I think they're using them independently for us because we will be able to distinguish them a little more easily
Hmm.
as we go through the content than the viewer would be.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. So let's start there, because that partisan one is a very interesting one. They use so in the Andor series, they've now said partisan. I think you pointed out it was lowercase p, right? So not a proper name, because
But
for
two or
any,
three times now, yeah.
yeah. So for anybody that doesn't know, we're going to eventually get Saul Guerrera in the series, and he is an extremist. He is what I would consider a terrorist based on the definitions we've got here, and he is his group. He calls them partisans, and I think we've talked about this enough. But in short, he didn't always start off that way. It's been a slowly, right, as the empire has continued to kind of tighten their grip, right, to coin a phrase. It has really put a lot of pressure on him. It's really, he's obviously fighting for the what happened to his sister. And there's a couple other things that happened. I want to bring up Rebel Rising again. I've got some examples there that I pulled out, but he didn't always start this way. He started more as a rebel and then maybe a freedom fighter, right?
Right.
Eventually he kind of
I think Freedom
evolved.
Fighter is probably where he began. And again, with Saw Gerrera, it's interesting because I think
Hmm.
you've always felt like he's been told he should be part of this bigger group.
Yeah.
But and this is where Partisan's a very good representation of him in particular and in his group is because they just don't fit in. They're this extra little piece, a sect that is really not extreme. I won't say extreme by default, but they just have a very low tolerance for playing well with others.
Hmm.
It's kind of how I view it.
Yeah. No, for sure.
And they want to move quickly. They want to just strike. They want to move to the next thing. Their planning is an instrument to deliver something in the almost immediate term, in the near term. You don't look a little further than that. And so I think when we look through these definitions, kind of glossary type of thing, it feels like it's it's just this quick hitter type of organization rather than an actual true deliberate response, long
Mhm.
term thinking. Like, no, we need to overthrow a government type of
Right.
thing.
Yeah, and like there's several definitions for partisan. The basic one says a strong supporter of a party, cause, or person. I mean, that could be a rebel, it could be a freedom fighter, etc. The one that was interesting though, and I think this is where they got the origin for this, was back from World War II, which says a member of an armed group formed to fight secretly against an occupying force, in particular one operating in enemy occupied Yugoslavia, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe. Right.
Right.
That seems more in line with the Saw Gerrera that we know and love, because he is kind of working in secret, secretly in the face of the empire and alongside the rebels, or what would soon become the Rebel Alliance.
But let me ask you a question.
Yeah,
When we meet Andor in Rogue One, doesn't it feel like he kind of fits that bill a little bit?
I think he does too. For me, no, it's a good point. I think,
It's within the organization, but it
yeah,
seems like we need a secret mission. We have these special, we would call them spec ops type of things, right?
exactly, clandestine operation, black helicopters, go in
Right.
the middle of the night kind of thing.
Right. So you can almost relate those two a little bit, but the difference is that they operate as their own independent cell, basically, and they don't really represent the ethics and beliefs and the culture of the greater rebellion of sorts. Sometimes I think is how I've been able to reconcile this different.
Yeah, and I think by the time we get to Rogue One, Andor, to me, feels more of a true partisan, right, in that regard. But he still fits under the umbrella, right? He's got pretty high clearance. They're not keeping him at arm's length. He's up there with all the Mon Mothmas, and he's got very high security type of intelligence type stuff. So I think they consider him to be part of the inner circle. So from that regard, I would say he's more of a Rebel Alliance member
Mhm.
proper, but his actions do align more with what partisan is, because it is very secretive. It's operative. It's fulcrum, right?
Right.
Which is a term specific to Star Wars, and we won't get into that. But yeah, so he is kind of operating in the shadows a lot of times.
So maybe explain freedom fighter to us because I think it's a good segue over to freedom fighter to see how that compares, and then maybe compare that with a rebellion in general.
Yeah. So freedom fighters, here's a good example, like, not to so and I know we've got international listeners, but most of what I know and all my talking points really are based around US history, right? So think about the Sons of Liberty, right? If you remember the Sons of Liberty, they were a militia group basically that stood up during the Revolutionary War. They also were militant, right? And that's kind of one of the key differences. You can be a rebel, but usually rebels they don't associate themselves with like combat. That's more in line with like a freedom fighter, sometimes more in line with maybe a partisan, depending on the situation. Definitely with like a revolutionist, a terrorist. 100% is going to have some kind of militant background.
So would you say a rebel is more, maybe a bit more closely aligned with an activist type of thing, but maybe just a step further than an activist?
Yeah, but they are being generally, they're, like, supported and funded, right? So you think about
Right. Well, I
we
guess
set up in
rebel is
the
still
'80s.
armed. The definition again still was arm resistance, so
Yeah,
there's still a militaristic component to it, I guess.
yes, and a lot of
Right.
times they're being supplied some of these folks, they're being funded and they're being armed by larger entities, right? So you think about our own politics again in the US. I mean, we had freedom fighters in the Middle East, we had freedom fighters down in South America, we've had them in, some of the African states, and we've been arming them and supplying them and teaching them and training them. This is very similar to going back to Clone Wars when we
Right.
meet Saw Gerrera, right? Anakin, Obi-Wan come by, they drop in. They're really trying not to win this war because they probably could turn the tide. It's really not their fight, but they're in the middle of a civil war on Onderon, and they go out and train Saw Gerrera and his folks as freedom fighters, and that's probably the truest definition. So, kind of like we said, he starts off as a freedom fighter. He probably shifts into more of a rebel, and then eventually he kind of loses his way for a number of reasons, but loses his way and becomes a true extremist and a terrorist. So it's an interesting evolution. That's why I'm so excited about him coming into this show. And I want to talk more about Saw Gerrera in a little bit because I do want to bring up Che Guevara, who is if you guys know who he is he's this guy right here, and I have a magnet of him, and I'm going to be full disclosure explain some things as to why I have this. I didn't go buy this for the show. This sits on the top side of my computer here all the times, but but yeah, so I want to get into him because that's who Saul Guerrero is based on. His last name's
Mhm.
Guerrera. This guy's name is Guevara or Guevara, I guess is how you would say that. But that's exactly what they were based on. And there's a lot of similarities between the two characters, believe it or not. So okay. So terrorism, I think we all know what this is, right? I mean, we're also in the wake of 9/11, this kind of really changed a lot of things for us. And terrorism is very interesting because prior to Attack of the Clones, we don't really have a lot of instances. And I'm not going to entertain the idea that the rebels were terrorists. I think we joked about that. It's always been a running joke, right? That the Empire never did anything. They were the establishment, and these terrorists led by Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, and Han Solo killed a bunch of innocent people and they should be put to death kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it was aboard that giant space station and killing planets and stuff, but beyond that, yeah, they're absolutely right.
Yeah. Right. But and that's
If you
really
set that aside,
that aside. But I mean, that's more in line with an actual rebel, like an actual revolution. And there's a difference between a rebellion and a revolution. Rebellions tend to be they still tend to be nonviolent. They take different approaches to that nonviolence. A revolution and they a lot of times try to work within the established government, right? They're just trying to get equal rights, get on level footing with the establishment when rebellion. In a part of a revolution, they are actively trying to overthrow the government. So again, Star Wars uses these words in all kinds of, they mix and match these words whenever they see fit. And what we see is probably truly a revolution because they're trying to overthrow the empire, but rebellion works too. So
and I think a key point with terrorism and in your description, you have violent criminal acts, right? And it's the criminal aspect of things that really goes to it is that these are people who don't care about the loss of life.
right.
They care about what they want to push forward, and it doesn't matter what the casualties are. It doesn't matter what the cost is, even if it's their own individual life.
Hmm.
They're giving it for this cause because that's what matters most. And they're willing to do whatever it takes.
Right.
We see with like Vel and Andor, and what we've seen so far is that they don't want to go that far to do that. And that's why when you look at a character like Saw, I mean, he borders on that. I mean, he goes into it, and you could probably make a case that Saw Gerrera is a terrorist. Certainly from the Empire's point of view, he is. He's probably the most extreme version of the rebellion, like as a general party. But you could probably argue that in general, he kind of is, yeah, at times. Maybe not all the time. He doesn't want to be, but he still kind of is at times. And
Yeah.
but I think when you look at the broader rebellion, they don't want to lose life. They want to give people the opportunity to surrender, lay down your arms, don't do this.
Right.
Not just turn on someone and fire at them in the street or hang them to make an example like the Empire is. There are different ways to try to make change, and it's just different variations of that. But I think when we talk about terrorism, that is usually a very key difference is that it doesn't matter how you do it as long as it gets done, and it doesn't matter what the ramifications are of that. Everything is a step forward towards victory.
Yeah. I want to go to the chat real quick. Jeff says that Onderon arc remains one of the best reflections of the cost of liberation and the way it can be later twisted for occupation I have ever seen. Amazing storytelling. I think that's what is that season 2 or 3 that arc is
3, I
in?
think. Yeah, I think season 3.
I forget now. And then also, wait, hard counters here. What's up, buddy? And then Jorge Castro says, I think Luthen is leaning more towards Saul's way. And I agree. Like
Kind of feels that way, doesn't it?
yeah, if you have
His
not
last
listened,
episode,
yeah, if you've not listened to the episode we just did on episode 7 announcement, we agree. Like just his tone, the way he's kind of bucking and challenging Mon Mothma, even though he's probably not necessarily wrong, the way he's going about it, and the way he is, hmm, the way he seems to be okay with certain losses. And a
well,
lot of
it's,
this is
it's very
skewed.
much a can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. It's
Yeah,
it's that mentality, right?
right, right. Well, and
And
it's
don't be naive that this isn't going to happen, but he's reconciled that it's okay is the difference.
yeah.
Yeah.
The comment that I think really kind of puts him in that box is when he said, "You need to check your conscience at the door." And I'm paraphrasing, right? But
Yep.
when he said that, it's like, whoa, wait a second. I mean, that, your moral compass is now spinning. It's a little skewed.
You have deviated from the path.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where I say, yeah, he's definitely lining up with somebody like Saw Gerrera or some of the other characters that Saw Gerrera is hanging around with at this time, anywhere from about 5 to 10 years prior to the events of Rogue One. And I'll give you an example, not now, but when we get to it just a little bit here. I actually pulled we've talked about the example.
Hey everyone, it's Jonesy. We hope you've enjoyed this preview of the Patreon episode. If you'd like to listen to the episode in full, we invite you to head over to cantinacast.com/Patreon. Access to this episode begins at the $2 After Dark tier. If you're interested in joining a future Patreon episode, we encourage you to check out our Now Part of the Tribe and Delusions of Grandeur tiers. You can find all the details at cantinacast.com/Patreon. On behalf of Albert and myself, thank you all for your continued support, and may the Force be with you.